This time we're turning our attention to particle feeding. Particle feeding is going to be a strategy used by animals that are feeding on the very fine stuff you can find in an aquatic environment. This is something that we can call plankton. Plankton can be categorized in two groups. One of those is going to be, trying to get my laser pointer to work. One of those is going to be phytoplankton. Phyto here means plant-like. Plankton is going to be smaller forms of life, and that is going to be a term used for microscopic algae. Here you see examples of diatoms, which are abundant both in freshwater and also in the oceans. Animals may have a sophisticated manner for collecting these objects, these cells that are so small the human eye usually cannot see them. Or animals may also be collecting zooplankton. And zooplankton, you can imagine, zoo means animal. Plankton, again, refers to very small objects. These are going to be sometimes the larvae of animals. Remember that many animals that live in water, like the oceans or lakes, may be what we call broadcasting spawners. When they breed, females release eggs, clouds of eggs into the water, males release the sperm. And so right there where fertilization is happening, the larval development will begin to take place as well, and that ends up feeding many animals that live underwater. Protozoans, protists, are going to be also examples of zooplankton. So there you have two forms of small, microscopic, for the most part, forms of food animals can collect. So what are the strategies animals can use? Let's begin by looking at suspension feeding. Suspension feeding has the characteristic that the animal must find a way to generate water currents, move water in the direction of the mouth. And at the mouth, or just inside of the mouth, there has to be a special type of tissue that can produce a mucus. The suspended food particles then become entrapped in the mucus, and either through cilia or other mechanical strategies, the mucus with the trapped food is aimed in the direction of the stomach of the animal. And yes, you're hearing correctly. Not only are animals feeding sometimes on that not very tasty stuff like decaying bodies of other things or plankton, but they're also feeding on their own mucus. You may say it's not a glamorous lifestyle, but it's going to be one that fits that optimal foraging theorem. Remember, we talked about this in class. Animals are going to be obtaining the type of food and consuming the type of food that will give them the greatest energy gain in return for the smallest effort. What animals can do this? You can see it in clams. Clams have modified gills that allow for the cilia lining the gills to secrete the mucus and also then guide, with the action of the cilia, the suspended food particles trapped in mucus in the direction of the mouth. Here you see examples of tunicates. You may remember these tunicates belong to the subphylum Urochordata. It's one of those invertebrate chordates where the notochord even disappears in the adult form. And they have siphons. They have an incurrent siphon, and they have the excurrent siphon, which is going to be smaller. The incurrent siphon has a mouth that secretes mucus, and the pharynx secretes the mucus, and then that traps the food the animal can collect. So before I move on to the next slide, I want to reinforce the idea that for suspension feeding, two conditions are needed. Number one is having some kind of a mechanism for guiding water with the suspended food particles in the direction of the mouth. And number two, you have to have the ability to secrete mucus, usually through an epithelial tissue, and then use that mucus to trap the suspended food particles so that they can be consumed. That is suspension feeding. Another strategy is going to be filter feeding. Filter feeding doesn't rely on mucus, but relies on a straining mechanism. Imagine something like a colander. Imagine something that can trap the fine stuff. And here you see, this is just a portion of the head of a whale. This is like the side of the mouth where you can see in greater detail those baleen. And you may know this, there are two kinds of whales, the ones that have teeth and the ones that have ballenes. The ballenes have many filaments that are just perfect for straining very small stuff from the water where these whales live. In fact, you may know this also, whales many times have one main food staple, these baleen whales for sure, and that is going to be krill. Krill is a very small shrimp-like kind of an organism that is really abundant in cold waters. Here you see something like a spoonbill. That's the name of this bird here, is a roseate spoonbill. The beak is flat and shaped like a spoon. And so what these animals do with the beak, they put it underwater and they begin like slapping the water. And what that does is that allows the gunk in the water, which includes plankton and other decomposing stuff, to stick to the bill. And so the bill is the straining structure. Whales, as I mentioned, an example, birds, flamingos can do this, ducks can do this too, spoonbills can do it as well. So now I want to emphasize the key point to remember. For filter feeding, the animal must have some kind of a straining mechanism, a way of mechanically picking this up from, food particles from the water. Deposit feeding is going to be a little bit different. In deposit feeding, animals are feeding on detritus or larvae or things that are settling to the bottom of a lake or the ocean. Here you see a type of worm. This is actually a worm, makes a little casing. Some people may mistake it as a mollusk because of the shell-like covering, but this is actually a polychaete worm. If you, let me see if I can enlarge this. Perhaps we can see that detail. At the one end here, it's not real clear to see. There are like gill-like projections. These are going to be like modified bristles of the animal. They work like gills for gas exchange, but they also help the animal collect all these little bits and pieces of decaying organisms, or maybe some algae or other plankton that is collecting at the bottom. So it's essentially like kind of like picking it up. But the strategy here is that the animal has to wait for these things to settle to the bottom, and that's the reason we call this deposit feeding. Food has to deposit, settle down to the bottom of the lake or the ocean before the animal can collect it. Here you see a modification here. A snail is using its own radula to pick up the stuff. The radula is like a modified rasping tongue mollusks have, and is using that for collecting all those bits and pieces of food that have collected at the bottom of the ocean. Limpets, snails, clams can also do this at times. And that's it for the topic of particle feeding. Suspension feeding has, particle feeding has three strategies, which will be suspension feeding, filter feeding, and deposit feeding. And I hope that you can spend some time thinking about the differences between them so you can recognize one mechanism from the other. And that's all for right now. We'll see you in class next time.